Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. And today we have a real veteran of the publishing industry in a very unique way. It is Mr. Michael Drew, who is the CEO of Promoter Book, and he is here to tell us all about the inside secrets of the publishing industry that I think as self-published authors we often aren't fully cognizant of. So Michael, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Other than a slight cold and a loss of voice, I'm doing quite well. Thank you.
No, I like it. It's husky. You should be narrating romance books.
Oh, yes.
And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks, Roland. And thanks, sir, for joining us, Michael. So tell us a bit about your company and what it is you do. I know that it's all about marketing and helping authors succeed, and it's mostly, nonfiction because, as we've discussed sort of recently on the podcast, that's sort of the kind of niche that works really well with some of this stuff with trying to get on the bestseller list and trying to do certain aspects of marketing work best for nonfiction versus fiction, especially when it comes to, the spend, right? The nonfiction authors often tend to have a different agenda in terms of what it is they want to accomplish with their book. Authors of fiction often want to sell a lot of copies, and that's how they're going to make their money. Whereas nonfiction is they want to sell a lot of copies so that they can sell their other services. So it's a very different model. But let's discuss that. So why don't you start off by telling us about everything on your...
I've been in publishing for 27 years as of this past August. I started off at a small company that was a division of the Covey Leadership Center back in '97 before it merged, before Covey merged with Franklin, became Franklin Covey. And the executive editor there, his name was Ken Shelton. And he was the ghostwriter for 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I worked there for about 3 months as an 18-year-old kid selling the magazine. And then the merger between Franklin and Covey happened. And Ken came to me and he said, "Hey, Mike, we publish all these great authors in our magazines. Why don't we start publishing their books?" And as a young, naive 18-year-old, I'm like, yeah, let's do that, right? And so I worked and set up a publishing company with Ken for a year. Figured out retail distribution, figured out author acquisition, all of those things, and marketing and roles and responsibilities. And I'd say I failed fairly miserably during that first year because I certainly didn't know what I was doing. But I learned a lot, and I impressed some pretty important people in the industry. And the distributor that I set us up with was a distributor called NBN, National Book Network. They used to be the largest independent retail distribution company in book publishing. And the retail part of the industry, just for your audience to know, the retailers like Barnes & Noble or Books A Million, formerly Borders, Amazon, they have an individual per category that makes a determination on how many copies of a book they're going to carry. And there's a set of standards and criteria, which we can get in later in the call if you want, but a set of standards and criteria that they apply in determining how many copies of your book, or if they're even going to carry your book, that they're going to put into their section of their store, right? And so when I started the industry, there were 16,000 publishers within 5 years. So there were 35,000 publishers. This was before self-publishing was easy. Like self-publishing back then required that you actually had to print the book. There was no such thing as print on demand. And so it was there just weren't that many self-published authors back then as there are today. In any case, so you can imagine that there were the publisher that I worked with, Executive Excellence, we published business titles. And there were back then about 8,000 unique titles being published for the business category. So you can imagine that the buyer at Barnes & Noble is not going to be able to read 8,000 books as part of their decision-making process in terms of carrying a book. And so they have the standard that they apply. And what they rely on is the relationship with the publisher. So if you're a New York publisher, the reason why they get better distribution than smaller publishers is that they have a better long-term history with the retailers in terms of that sell-through. And so they go with what is known, with the data that's available. And but for the small and medium-sized publishers like we were, you have what are called distributors, NBN in this case. Now, NBN at the time had like 1,000 publishers, and like 800 of them were nonfiction. And so basically all of those publishers were going to be competing with the publisher I worked for in terms of trying to get the attention of the distributor and then also the attention then of the retailers. And so, internally they have a sales rep for Barnes & Noble and a sales rep for Amazon, a sales rep for Books A Million, and so forth. But they're not going to be able to represent all 800 publishers equally. And so a big distributor has a model where they have the sales reps at the top, and then below that are publisher reps. And the publisher reps might represent 20 publishers. And the objective of the publisher rep is to go figure out from their 20 publishers what the top 4 or 5 titles are going to be for those 20 publishers. So not all of the books are they going to rep. They're going to take the top 3, 4, 5 books, and then they'll present that to the sales reps at the sales conference for the publisher or for the distributor. And so the sales rep that I had that we were assigned by NBN was a woman by the name of Miriam Bass. She died a number of years ago, but she was a legend in book publishing. She was the first woman buyer for a retail chain in California called Chapters that went bankrupt ultimately, but she was the first woman buyer in the industry. And she was a very well-known, powerful woman, and she was our sales rep. And I worked really hard in my failure and impressed her. And there was another publisher out of Austin, Texas called Bard Press, B-A-R-D Press. And they had just come off of a huge success with a book titled Nuts, Southwest Airlines' Crazy Recipe for Success. Had sold several million copies of the book. And Ray Bard, who's the owner of Bard Press, told Miriam, who was also a sales rep, that he wanted to find a marketing director to come in and help them have more bestsellers. So Miriam recommended me at 19. Ray interviewed me and he hired me. And the first day on the job, he said to me, Michael, we publish business authors. What our authors want more than anything else in the world is to be a New York Times bestseller. What I want you to do is go figure out how the New York Times bestseller list works. And so that's exactly what I did. And it's funny because I was young enough that I was willing to ask the questions that other people weren't. I literally called the person at the New York Times. His name was John Wright, who compiled the list and said, hey, I'm Mike Giroux over at Bard Press. My boss told me to find out what your rules for making the list were. Would you tell me? And he laughed and said, no. That's right. I called Jackie Blaze over at USA Today, and she said the same thing. Talked to Bob Hughes over at Wall Street Journal, and he said the same thing. Like, just had those conversations. But I started gathering little bits of data and information from these conversations. And the first book that Ray Bard had me work on was a book titled Secret Formulas of the Wizard of Ads by Roy H. Williams. Now, Roy is a legend in marketing and advertising. He owns the 4th largest ad agency in North America for buying radio advertising. And he founded a number of years later what we call the Wizard Academy out of Austin, Texas. It's a nonprofit business communication school. In any context, Ray had me work on that campaign, and I developed a strategy where we leveraged Roy's reputation in the radio industry by mailing an advance copy of the book out to the general manager of every radio station in North America, about 6,000 stations. And we mailed it out. This is 99, right? So you're talking technology wasn't quite where it's at today. Amazon existed, but it certainly was a small.
Self-publishing was 10 years away.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, exactly. So it was a very different space. And what we did is the offer that I had us put together was if the radio station bought 20 copies of the book and ran 200 radio ads promoting the book, we would give them a copy of a video training series from Roy. And it was on VHS, right? So just from a time standpoint, on VHS from Roy, teaching the sales reps of the radio stations how to sell more radio. Now, the book argued that radio was the best form of advertising for smaller, medium-sized retail business. And so coupling the book with the training allowed the sales reps to give the book away to potential clients and then apply Roy's model and get more clients. And so We had 781 stations participate, something like that, in the offer. And we launched the book to #1 on the Wall Street Journal and #3 on the New York Times bestsellers list. And that was 27 years ago. So first of now 132 consecutive New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, now Success Magazine bestsellers.
Can I just put a pin in that? I have a weird history. One of my first jobs was selling radio advertising. And when I got the role selling radio advertising, I was given a book by a guy called Gifford, who was an American who sold. And I was just, so are you trying to tell me that in exchange for those radio ads, you gave the training materials?
Yes.
Instead of cash?
Correct.
I salute you, sir, but also I think that's probably how I got the training materials from America that I did, and they taught me everything I wanted to know about. They had huge value. So, but also that's really quite smart of you to be able to exchange something of such huge value for the books themselves.
Well, I appreciate it. It's one of the things that I began learning working at Bard Press and at the Executive Excellence Publishing Company. I learned the machinations of the industry, right? At Bard, what I very quickly realized was that a book is never, in nonfiction, is never about the book. It's always about the outcome of the author, right? So every one of the authors I've worked with had a business reason for writing and promoting their book, right? And so with that, what you become a student of is platform, right? And the idea of platform, it goes back, 200 years ago. You would have pastors and missionaries and politicians, and they would stand on a soapbox, right? Soapbox, so that which is a platform, so that they would be elevated above the crowd. Because if you've got a crowd and you're talking straight into it, your voice is going to get lost and muffled in the crowd. You need a platform so that your voice goes over the crowd so that it can be heard, right? And so a platform or a stage is about the being able to have your voice heard above the noise, above the crowd. And so there are lots of different types of platforms that exist. And certainly as technology has advanced and changed over the years, there become even more types of platforms that exist. But at the end of the day, a platform's objective is to have your voice heard above the crowd. And so in order to be able to help an author succeed, the first thing you had to do, and this is important for your audience, was define what the outcome was, right? What is the outcome we're trying to accomplish? The second is, how are we measuring that we've done that, right? So define the outcome, define the measurement metric. If we can't measure that we can accomplish the outcome, we're not going to be able to know that we've really accomplished that outcome. So measurement is next. Below that is strategy, right? And so the strategy has a bunch of tactical elements that its objective is to be able to create the outcome through the measurement metric. And then from there, you define what tactics are supportive of that strategy. Most marketers, most direct response marketers as well, and I call them douchebag marketers, are tacticians. They do a tactic really, really well. And as the adage goes, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But when you're dealing with leadership versus selling a commodity, what you're selling is distinctly different, right? Because when you sell a commodity like a can of soda, price makes as much a difference as anything else. Like I always use the example of buying a can of soup. You might prefer, as an example, Healthy's Choice. You go into the grocery store and you want to get your vegetable soup from Healthy's Choice, but the Campbell's version of the exact same soup is on sale at half the price. Most people are going to buy the Campbell's soup at half price because it's a commodity and we're not buying based on relationship, but more on a transactional need. When you work in the sphere that I do, you're dealing with changing bodies or minds or hearts or souls, right? You're dealing with some fairly intangible things. They can ultimately be measured. Like if it's a diet or a workout, if you give yourself a month or two, you'll see the changes, but it's not an immediate instant thing. Like I'm drinking a can of soda, right? It's not transactional. And so what you have to do is learn how to build trust with your audience, with your customer base, to the point where they're going to trust you with those really important things that are much more difficult to, not impossible to measure, but much more difficult, much usually longer time frame to be able to measure the outcomes for. And so when we then apply that against platform, it becomes a question of how do we take the author's existing business, the existing relationships that they have, use those relationships aimed at the outcome through the measurement metric, and be able to accomplish that outcome and to use a book in doing so, right? And so, I created the bestseller industry that exists today. Anybody that works in the industry has either broken out from somebody that has broken out from me, or I am the silent partner behind the scenes doing the work for them. So there's just, it's the industry that I built. And I can tell you that getting a book on a bestseller list, any of them, you could pay to do it. Like you could even ethically pay to do it, right? You don't have to be unethical in paying for it. There's just a set of standards that you have to meet in order to qualify. There's a difference between making a bestseller and having that have actual meaning and impact on your business and your outcome, right? And so for me, the bestseller strategy of what we do is always a secondary component. It's the outcome of doing the right thing to meet the outcome for the business, and doing it in a way that happens to use the book. And if we do that the right way, then we'll be a bestseller, and also we'll create the business outcome. And so when I was working at Bard Press, I became a student of platforms. So with Roy, it was understanding radio and radio stations and what types of businesses advertise and how they're sold, and what was the best way to leverage that. The next book I worked on was by Ivan Meisner. I've worked with both of them on many, many books, but Ivan Meisner is the founder of BNI, Business Network International. It's the world's largest business referral organization, right? And so we did a book titled Masters of Networking. Masters of Networking leveraged Ivan's franchise owners. They call them the executive directors within BNI. BNI is a franchise organization. And what we did is we had, in the United States, in North America, we had the franchise owners contribute a chapter to a book. And then what I did is I had each of them hire a local PR firm to do local PR. And what we did is we did what we called Masters Day. And we held 56 book signings on the same day at the same time throughout all of North America. We broke a Guinness World Record, and we used it as a membership drive for BNI, right? Because that's how they make money. They grow the membership base. So we used the book to be able to, and the event, specifically Masters Day, to be able to become a membership drive for BNI. Every book I've worked on 5 double the size of BNI every time, because that's the membership, because that's the objective of what we were trying to do, the outcome and measurement of that, right? And so, right, so just another example. What is BNI? How does it work? How does it function? How do they make money? What's the driving motivator of the people that are involved? Franchise owners want more members to make more money. Members of individual chapters want more members in their chapters, because it means when the referrals are happening to them, they're getting more referrals, right? So there's just a lot of different benefits to the different members. And so what I became a student of was platform. So I'm known for the bestseller side, because that's the sexy thing that I do. Like, it's really sexy. But really, at the end of the day, what we actually do is build thought leadership platforms.
I know, I find that really fascinating. I think that's something that we've come across before. We most often talk, I think, to fiction authors, and the business behind being a fiction author is different to the business behind being a nonfiction author, because often as a nonfiction author, like, your book is just one of many ways to create a connection with somebody new. Because if you are a New York Times bestseller author about this particular topic, and you meet someone new and they're like, oh, you're New York, that means something and it has value. So even if, like, you lost money on the whole process of having your book be published and reach the bestseller list, you will probably make all that money back in terms of the additional business that comes to you. So there's a very rational business decision behind actually achieving that. But And I think that's part of the thing. It becomes worth it. And I love what you said about there being ethical ways and non-ethical ways to get to the New York Times bestseller list. Because I know in our last conversation, I think we spoke about, I think it was Eric Trump or something, his book, the RNC, bought 500,000 copies of. So that was a convenient boost to his ratings. And there's an author in the UK called Mark Dawson who got in trouble for buying 400 copies of his book just to nudge him over the final line. So I find it fascinating what you're saying about that.
So let me address 2 points. Let me address the fiction really quick versus, and then the best ethics. Fiction's interesting, a lot more complicated. Fiction books sell, but then fiction is on about 8%. So there's actually money that also, again, the amount of money that you can make if you sell your serial rights on a fiction book is much more money than you'll likely ever make on a nonfiction book, right? So the high end is very high, but there's not a lot of middle ground between book sales and the high end, right? You might get a speaking gig, but there's just not as much opportunity there in the middle. Now, the big difference, though, Nicole, is that in fiction, there is actually a business model that can be followed that you can't follow in nonfiction that allows a book by itself to be profitable. On the nonfiction side, I'll tell you that of my 132 books, only 7 of those authors made more money from book sales than from against the marketing costs. Now, all of them made money to their platform. I have 110 clients that permanently increased their gross revenue by $1 million. I have 10 clients that permanently increased their gross revenue by $50 million. I have 7 that increased their gross revenue by $100 million, right? But if you took book marketing costs versus revenue directly from book sales, only 7 of them made money, and it was after selling 1 million or more copies of the book, right? So it's hard to make money on nonfiction from the book sales directly. But the difference with fiction is that you're dealing with entertainment. You're dealing with engaging an audience member. So if you're willing to look at other models, like the radio in the 30s or TV or even movie series now, there are models where you can actually make more, you can make money on your book today. So as an example, if you have a full length science fiction book, it's 500-600 pages long. If you don't release it as a full book, but you serialize it in 12 months of novelettes, and you sell those one at a time, just like somebody watching a TV series, waiting for the next month for the next episode. If you do that every single month, predictably, it doesn't take a huge following to make money. If you have 500 buyers per month, 500 people following it, that's five, and you're selling it for $20, you're making $10, that's $5,000. You get to just 5,000 people and you're making $10 a month. That's $50,000 a month that you're making from the nonfiction platform side. Would be a relatively small, very small platform. Like you wouldn't be able to have a successful business based on that audience size. And so, but on fiction, if you're willing to really get into that and serialize it, and then like from a business standpoint, you look at what movies do today and TV series in terms of creating additional content on your website, backstories, things that you're not putting in the book, but things that give meaning and layering to the story that you're telling, then you keep your audience engaged and you can actually get into profitability much easier than a nonfiction author can. Because nonfiction, their objective is not book sales. Their objective is the growth of the business in some capacity. Whereas the benefit of it only being about book sales is that you can design the modeling so that you can make money. You're still killing rabbits versus elephants in terms of modeling, but it doesn't take as many there because you don't have to put the same amount of time and money into the marketing.
Yeah, that's the big difference is, fiction authors aren't going to be spending huge money on these marketing campaigns because, they're, as you put it, their outcome is selling more books, and measuring that, is by book sales, and that's the money they make. Their outcome is not, some big speaking engagement. So they have that money.
They have to, and this is also why I advise the serialization, because if you have one book coming out every year or every other year, it's really hard. That makes it really hard to keep an audience engaged. But if you're constantly putting content out, it could be the same content that you would have put in the full book. But if you're constantly putting it out, you can engage it just like we engage on TV shows, right? And so that modeling really well.
That model though is not proving to be as successful. That the Kindle Vella collapsed first, then Radish, they've recently collapsed, and that was their model, right? There was the serialization of books. If you're doing it yourself, if you have that built-in audience, then absolutely, but it's a lot more work to do that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. In my estimation, you have to build the audience anyway, whether you're fiction or nonfiction. It's just you don't have to build as big an audience on fiction.
Right.
So for me, and this is what I learned on the nonfiction side, but the platform should be yours, right? You shouldn't be sharing it per se with somebody else, which is what you had in the other technologies. You were relying upon a technology to bring you the audience. Right. To me, you've got, and this is true for nonfiction, you have owned platform and borrowed or shared platform, right? And so if you own it, you control it. It shows you use the borrowed or the rented or the whatever to drive traffic back into your owned platform, so that you can keep those audience members engaged and yours on an ongoing basis. But you have to recognize that you don't own those. In fact, all advertising and marketing fits into that category when it's not yours, right? And so platform then is the scaffolding that you're standing on that you build to be able to get that out within the market and where you're being seen and heard by your audience members, and then how you're engaging them to come back to you. So what TV does really well is they, and I like to look at different models. They do a really good job of creating anticipation, giving good content, and making you desire what's going to happen next. And they own it. Like, it's not like, if you're CBS, it's your show. I mean, yes, it can go into it can be syndicated after the fact, but to start off with, it's your show for CBS or ABC or HBO or whomever else, and they own that. They own the media around it. They own the social media around that. They control it. So I would advocate doing it on your site, and putting the impetus into driving to you. You could sell the book at Amazon. That's fine. People feel comfortable buying it off of Amazon, but the engagement should be with you, not shared with others. It's where you're having the conversation. On the bestseller front, I mentioned earlier that it's a lot of work. I don't care if it's fiction or nonfiction to be a bestseller, and necessarily money. I can pay PR firms to get me big media. I can pay, there's lots of, I think that's ethical. I think I can advertise online. I can do traditional advertising. I can do a lot of things to be able to make a book work. But that's not as efficient as first building my audience and marketing to the audience, right? And so in that regards, when I say ethical versus non-ethical, if the author is buying their own books, that's not ethical. If the author is putting a bunch of money to buy ads, that's perfectly ethical. It may not be fair, that's a different thing. But if you are genuinely buying ads, why is that wrong? In my mind, there's nothing wrong with buying ads.
No.
But there is
one of my clients who in the radio business told me, he said, it doesn't matter how much money you spend advertising if someone doesn't want to buy the product. So I think that's why it's ethical, because whatever you spend on advertising, if you get that back by your product being sold, it means your product is worth the value that you're advertising it at.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. So there is a big line for me versus ethics versus non-ethical in how you're doing it, right? If you are just buying it yourself, that's not ethical. And in fact, let me back up and define what is a bestseller and who is it for. Because authors forget this a lot. Authors think that a bestseller list is for them. It's not. The bestseller list does not exist for the authors. A bestseller list exists for the readers of the publication for which the bestseller list is being published in. The purpose of a bestseller is to help curate the recommendations of what books that publication believes should be read based on how they're selling. The objective of a bestseller list is for the consumer to be able to say, oh, of all of the 8,000 business books published last year, here's 5 marketing books from this list that I should consider. Here's 5 science fiction books or whatever. So it's not about the author. Does it benefit the author? Yes. Is there intrinsic value to the author? Yes. But if you look at the bestseller list as meant for you as the author, then you're likely going to misuse that list, and you're likely going to be willing and open to doing unethical things because you're trying to make the list have value to you versus you're giving value to the list, if that makes sense.
That does. That's always actually a good philosophy. Whatever you do in life is to try and provide value to people rather than try and get value back. But I totally see where you're coming from with that.
That doesn't mean that you can't that's not a leverageable opportunity. It is. But this is where, for me, that the platform and the definition of outcome and measurement is so important, because what you want to do is build the scaffolding in the platform that you're building and growing, fiction or nonfiction, and then look at the book in terms of helping the building and the growth of that platform. And because your content is not for you, right? That's the thing. If the content was for you, you'd be Emily Dickinson, and you'd write your content and you wouldn't care if it got published or read. If you are publishing content, if you're out there writing a book or a blog post, your objective is to share that with others. You are saying that this is for you, right? Because it is ultimately for the reader at that point. And so what you look at then is, how are you writing and creating the book, but also the broader ecosystem, the platform that delivers the values and the needs to the reader. Because again, it's not about you as the writer, it's about why is the reader reading the book. It's a little easier in nonfiction to discuss than fiction, although it's still there in fiction. But when you buy a diet book, you're buying it for a reason. If you're buying a book on sales, you're buying it for a reason. If you're buying a book on leadership, you're buying it for a reason, right? The buyer has an intent and purpose that they want to get out of the book, which has nothing to do with you as the author at all. It has nothing to do with you at all. It has everything to do with the reader. And so for me, everything that I do and the way that I look at platforms is, how do we deliver the value to the end user, to the reader? And how do we do that in a way that also allows us to accomplish our outcome, right? If we're here and our customers are here and we're not aligning, nothing's going to sell. The objective is to create that crossover between our objectives and the author and the reader's objectives, to be able to create that alignment so that something can happen with that book, so that we can make the difference with the audience, and that hopefully that difference will allow us to be able to grow our business in whatever capacity, so that we can then continue to make a difference. And that's, at the end of the day, what it's about. It's about, even if you value money over making a difference, you have to be able to deliver enough value to your audience, to your customer base, on an ongoing basis, that they want to continue to engage with you. And so, to me, that's why it's all about the platform. And ethical book marketing, then, bestseller or not, is going to always be focused on the reader, the customer. Because at the end of the day, that's the starting block, the foundational block of your platform and of the movement that you're creating.
I wonder, it seems to me that it swings a little, like, eventually you hit a point where you get so successful that now you're selling books based on who you are, right? Like, celebrities can do it. But, look, if you think of business people like, say, Tony Robbins, right? He puts out a new book. His followers, they'll buy it based on his name. And sure, he's got a platform, and they do, but it could be a book about something completely different than his other ones, but they'll still probably buy it, or a big portion of them will.
So with that, but that goes back to platform, right? Because, that I don't know if you knew this, but I want to say 2012, 2013, that Tony Robbins had a show on CBS.
I didn't watch it, but
the worst God, for 3 episodes, it was the worst viewed show from a percentage of viewership in the history of the 3 major networks, and they took it off the air. You're in business, so you know who Tony Robbins is. They did a study after the show, want to figure out why it didn't work. And they went around and they interviewed people in major cities around the country on the streets, like 10,000 people. And they asked, who's Tony Robbins? Less than 7% of Americans knew who Tony Robbins was. Okay.
Wow, I find that fascinating, actually.
7%. And do you know where most of those people knew him from?
That film with Jack Black.
Yes, Shallow Hal. That's exactly right. So with that as a consideration, in his niche, in his platform, he's a very big name, but he is actually limited to that platform and to that niche. And so yes, that audience necessarily is there, but I can also tell you that, right now he's doing a lot with a gentleman by the name of Dean Graziosi, who's a client of mine, and they're doing a lot. They've released a couple of books. And I guarantee you, they're going through the same process. They have the same kind of campaign, because it's not sufficient to just have an audience. You have to actually engage and motivate them to go and buy. To just put a book out isn't sufficient. In fact, for fiction authors, whether it's a J.K. Rowling or any other major fiction author, the reason you do PR is to let people know that the book is available. Like it's hey, the book is out there. You can go and buy it now. If you don't do that, the probability of selling is not very high. The NPR, it's been about a decade now, but NPR did a study on the book buying habits in the United States, and what they found was that 17% of American households bought one book per year. Again, this was about a decade ago now. It's probably less than that, I would guess. But it was about 17% of American households just bought one book per year. Now, some of us buy hundreds of books per year. That probably skews that number. And also, there are a lot of families that have kids in school that are buying mini books for those kids. So it's probably a smaller number than 17% buying a larger number. But it was 17% buying just on average one book per year. They then looked at the next question is, of the people the households that bought the one book, what percentage read the book? So if the 17% becomes the new pie, the new 100%, 11% of that number read the book. So when you look at it at the end of the day, it's less than 2 or 3% of Americans who are buying and reading books. And so, in fact, with our nonfiction authors, what we do is not only release the audiobook, but we usually release an online video training that says the exact same thing that's in the book at the same time that we normally give as a bonus with the book, because we don't care to them if they listen to the book or if they read the book or if they watch it in video. We just want them to consume the content. So we're giving them every conceivable means for being able to consume that content. And so I'm really aware of that. And to me, the need for marketing is about the amplification of voice. Right? You've got 2 parts. One, you've got an existing audience with platform that you deepen the relationship with. And the other is to start new conversations by having that voice amplified and having people discuss that book and that content. And that's what marketing does. But your main objective is to get people to want to continue to come back to you and to develop a relationship with you as a writer or as a business author or business owner.
What are the strategies you're using to create those platforms? Because I imagine it's got to be there's probably some elements that are very similar for every author, but then there's probably those that are very different depending on what they're.
Yeah. So yes, you're correct. There are tools that we use today that are going to be the same. How we use the tools are going to be different from one project to the next. But the first thing is, what is the outcome? I hate to keep going back here, but how do we define and measure success? Right? That's the most important thing we can answer, because that dictates the strategy, and the strategy then dictates the tactics. Right? And so the question that you're asking has to first be answered by, what are we doing? What are we creating? We go through a couple of processes. We first define that, and then we create what are called buyer personas, which represent different segments of the overall audience. We borrow from Hollywood on this, from how they do character arc. If you or your audience aren't familiar with what Aaron Sorkin does when putting a series together, I would advocate going and researching that. It's quite interesting. But we do the same thing in marketing. What he does is he'll create backstories on all of his characters before he writes a lick of script. And like on West Wing was something like 10,000 pages of backstory, because what he wanted to do is figure out it's all for him about character arcs. So how are the different characters interacting with each other through the plot line of the show? And that requires having a lot of backstory and information. And so we do the same thing in marketing. We look at the backstory of how did the consumer get to a point where they have this need? What is the driving factors? What's their psychographic? What are they embracing? What are they avoiding? What part of the country are they from? Or are they from overseas? What's their education level? Right. All of these are factors in meeting the customer where they're at, so that we can put them on a journey, a buyer's journey. Right. And so we define the outcome, we define the customers through persona architecture, and then we map out the buyer's journey through a process called the 12 steps of intimacy, based on the work of Desmond Morris. Desmond Morris in the late 50s and 60s was a zoologist and a clinical researcher. And there was a question in the late 50s and 60s about the nature of the Homo sapien primate. Were we a promiscuous or pair-bonded species of primate? And Desmond Morris did the work in the field. And at the end of his study, he defined that the Homo sapien primate prefers pair-bondedness over promiscuity. With primates, they run the gamut. The bonobos that'll screw anything, even interspecies, to the gorillas that'll have one, maybe two mates for life. They don't. And the whole range of it is based on a very specific anatomical feature of the male of the species. And Homo sapien men happen to fit smack in the middle, so that's why they did the research. And the question was pair-bondedness versus promiscuity. And so we have a desire for emotional security as a species, so we want pair-bondedness, even though we still desire promiscuity. So what he then asked, relevant question was, what then defines a long-term relationship? And what he determined was that he did another study, and what he found at the foundational level of all long-term relationships, there are these 12 fundamental steps of intimacy that have to be followed. And if more than one step is skipped, so it could be 2 and 4, 3 and 7, 5 and 6, pick any two. You can skip one, and it doesn't create a problem. You skip 2, and the likeliness of that being a long-term relationship is the same as having a one-night stand.
Wow.
About 3%. And so, in fact, modern marriage counseling is based on this 12 steps idea. The way that Desmond described it was, it's kind of like laying tile. If you start off half inch in your tile off over here, by the time you get to the other end of the room, you're going to be a foot off. It doesn't feel like a big deal to begin with, but over time, it starts to spread apart.
I just put some flooring down in my living room, and I know that is absolutely 100% true. I wish I paid attention to that before, a month earlier. Right.
So that's true in relationships. Well, so for us, for me, because of the work that we do with thought leaders and influencers, where it's not transactional but relational based, that modeling of relationship that applies in pair bonded long-term relationships is basically the same with building a relationship with a friend or with a customer. Right. You're still building intimacy and trust. And so we then take those buyer personas and map out what the 12 steps of intimacy are for each of those personas, so that we can always show them respect, right? And that then helps us determine more of the strategy and more of the tactics that are being used, because we know what our outcome is as a business. We know what the audience and customer is looking for, and we've mapped out all of the little teeny intimate things that we don't consciously normally think about, but we've mapped it out within the building of the platform. Now, from a tool standpoint, yes, we use websites. Yes, we use social media. Yes, we use podcasts. Yes, we use blogs and video or YouTube channels. Those are all ways of getting messaging out into the market and meeting the customer where they're at. The idea then is, when you're pointing those things, what are they pointing to within the 12 steps of intimacy?
I find that really interesting, because we often, even with fiction, we often talk to authors about there being like 4 reasons why people buy books. And one of them normally only applies to nonfiction, in that it solves a problem. But then there's, does it have social proof? All the reviews is a part of Oprah's book club. Then there's the, does it have a great hook? like something that really grabs you. And the most important one is the relationship with the reader. And you look at someone like Jack Carr, who I think is just blown it out of the water. You know, he's the author of The Terminalists and stuff like that. He is selling bucket loads of books for precisely all the reasons you said. He's got his personality out there. He's out there hunting elk and having a big beard and you know, doing lots of cool stuff that people like. And it's kind of like part of, by buying his book, you're buying into what he represents as a person. And I think that's something that a lot of authors who don't want to put themselves out there and be part of social media, they have to kind of face the reality of, is like, whatever you are selling in your book, you can sell it more efficiently if you represent that as a person.
It's interesting that you say that they would have a problem with it. Did you ever read the book Ender's Game?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that was one of my favorites.
So what does Peter and what's the sister's name do? Her name will pop up in a minute. They not in the movie, but in the book, they take over the politics on Earth.
Right.
Do you remember how they do that?
I read it when I was a kid, but I remember loving it.
So
he's very likable.
Well, so it's interesting. It came out in 1980, right? But they basically talked about the internet as we know it today, with video channels and podcasting channels and blog content, all this stuff. They had different names for it, right? But it's basically what they described. And what they did is they went out and created fictional characters that were in political opposition with each other. And then they went out and they created, based on those personas, they went out and wrote and created all sorts of AI content and stuff, in arguing with each other to try to move the politics one way, until they finally, the objective was to get to a point where they could agree on something towards what they wanted to do with the buggers, which are the bad guys of the series, right? And so I bring that up because if you're a fiction writer and you don't want your face to be seen, we live in a day and an age where being able to use your skills in creating fiction should be very easy for you to be able to create a fictional character that is that allows you to stay safe and unseen, but allows you to engage with your audience.
Yeah, I mean, fiction authors thrive on their anonymity a lot more than I think the business and the nonfiction side, where, like you said, they're trying to build a platform. So it's much more important for everyone to know exactly who you are when you're writing these books.
Yes. His name was Valentine. It was Peter and Valentine.
Right. That was his brother, right? Yeah.
Yes, his older brother, the really, really violent one, and his sister who was too empathetic, and he was just right in between.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, Michael, we are approaching the top of the hour, so we're going to have to wrap things up very smoothly without any complications whatsoever. But I was going to say, thank you so much for everything you've shared with us. It was really fascinating to see like a different angle to it, because I think as authors, you're right, we often think about what's in it for us in terms of publishing, but you're right, it's all about the people who buy and read the book. So where can people find out more about you, more about your company, more about how you might be of service to them?
Great. So my marketing agency is promoteabook.com. I try to keep things simple. promoteabook.com. For those that are interested in writing a nonfiction book, we do a retreat in Guatemala for a month a year, where the promise is by the end of the month your book will be written. We've got a publisher lined up for you. So we got a fun process, and our website for that is bookretreat.com, because again, I try to keep it simple. BOOKREAT.com, bookretreat.com.
Fantastic. Well, we will pop a link down to the link of that. Sorry, Guatemala. I was just like, that sounds quite exciting to go to. So we'll pop a link down in the description down below. So if you have enjoyed everything that Michael has shared with us, then make sure you scroll down there, click on that link, and go and check it out. And while you're down there, you pass that big empty comment box. So please leave a comment. Let Michael know how much you appreciated everything that he shared with us today. And also whether you know who Tony Robbins is or not. I imagine everyone listening to this knows who Tony Robbins is. I don't think you've become a writer unless you've stumbled across him, because he gives us the motivation to write. But yes, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fully Booked. So until then, cheerio.